Välkommen allesammen. This is the most important video I've done maybe on the whole history of this channel. There is a spiritual warfare going on that lasted a very long time, and funeral practices are kind of at the center of it. The funeral is honestly the most important of all practices of any spirituality, any religion around the world. It's done in many different ways, in different places, in different religions, for different reasons, although the origin of those traditions may have been from so long ago that people actually forget why they do them, but originally all these funeral rites around the world were done for many specific reasons. But at the end of the day, all funeral rites around the world are done for a couple general reasons: to influence the afterlife that you go to, or maybe even how quickly or efficiently you get there, or maybe even who or what you would like to bring with you. That is what a lot of these funeral rites are actually about. Seems pretty important, you know, if we can do a little extra ritual here and there at a funeral to somehow benefit the way we spend the rest of eternity, wouldn't you want to do so? And I think there is a big problem going on in the world, and it's been going for a long time now. Some of the higher powers promoting some unnatural funeral customs, and even creating new laws, regulations, prohibiting some of these ancient funeral practices that go against what humans have done forever, and it's affecting our spirituality and relationship with death in a negative way, and it's absolutely not something that should be going on in places in the world that say they have religious freedom. So there are many ways to conduct a funeral from all kinds of beautiful cultures all around the world, but this video we're speaking about the Norse. If we were to recreate the funeral in the exact way that it was done long ago, what things would be done and why? So, bad news, guys, is there are basically no clear records of a full Norse funeral. This practice was purposely left out of the written sources from the time. As most of you know, all of the sources back then that were written about the Viking Age were done by Christians, and they tried very hard not to write too much about the pagan religion and practice. The funerals is the main thing that they basically just skip over and leave out in these sagas. There are many records of pagans dying and getting buried, or even getting cremated, but there are basically no detailed accounts of a funeral. Every time a funeral comes up in the Norse sagas, they simply say, "and he was buried according to the customs of the time," or maybe it says, "a funeral was given according to the old ways." No other information is given other than that. But we do have quite a few scattered sources that is going to give us plenty of clues, and that's what I'm going over in this video. I'm not going to go over a lot of the archaeological evidence. We could, but people read into that a bit too much. All the archaeological evidence is really going to tell us is were people buried with their valuable items that they wanted to take with them to the afterlife. Okay, yeah, duh, we know that. But I will cover archaeological things such as what position people were buried in, and maybe any other items they might have been buried with that has some spiritual significance. I'm also not going to go over in this video funeral practices from other cultures around the world. Now that is very important, and I will have to do another video on that for sure, because that's when we can really start to develop some answers. But that would just get way too long and speculative, so I'm not covering too much of that in this video. So yeah, and just know that we can speak about funerals for days, really. But in this video, I'm just keeping it academic to the Norse sources and evidence about actual funeral practices. First source, just to, start and give a broad overview, we're going to speak about Heimskringla and Ynglinga Saga. Funerals were practiced differently in different times in the north of Europe. Even people of the same religion following this Norse religion, just a few hundred years apart from each other, and maybe even in the same time period where, different social classes were practicing funerals very differently. In the prologue, right before Ynglinga Saga starts, which is the time when Odin was said to live here, estimating from that, it should be around 2,000 years ago, right about the time of Jesus is when he was estimated to live from this source. And in here, the story goes that it begins in the cremation age, where basically everyone was cremated in the north of Europe. However, when a king of Sweden, Yngvi Freyr, was buried in his mound at his funeral at the time, that's when it changed. That's when other chieftains or kings started to have themselves buried too. And at that time, some places actually resorted to more burials, and some resorted to cremation to start. So that brings us right about the 1st century. And this agrees with the archaeological evidence too, because before about the 1st century, we find very, very little burials. So probably, most people probably did get cremated if we go back to around that time. But if we go back even before then, from 2,000 years to maybe 600-700 years BC to the Bronze Age and before, we all of a sudden find way more burials. See my video on the Bronze Age I did about that. So we have the burial age, then we get to the cremation age, and then after Freyr, because we get closer to the Viking Age, we get a lot more burials, and then a good mix of burials and cremations. In the Viking Age, actually, it was a combination of both, it seems. Why is all of this? I'll get to that in a minute. But first, another very important source in Ynglinga Saga. Here it says that Odin established a law when he migrated to the north of Europe from Asaland. Basically that everything burned with you on the funeral pyre could come with you to Valhöll. The treasure, the swords, the weapons, the slaves, whatever was buried with you would come with you to the afterlife. But you would also get to take specifically to the afterlife the riches that you yourself buried in the earth. This source doesn't give much records about the actual funeral, but I only bring this one up because it agrees with some of the other sources. One source being Egils Saga, where before Egil died actually, he rode off on his horse alone and he buried a bunch of treasure by himself when he was sick and dying, basically. His children were not too happy that he buried treasure by himself because no one knew where it was. But this shows that same kind of thing, that if you bury, for example, a sword, and you bury it yourself personally before you die, it could be anywhere, then that item would come with you to the afterlife. But if that item, let's say if that sword, if it was buried with you after you are already dead, maybe not. Maybe it wouldn't come with you to the afterlife. If you had already died and you wanted your sword to come with you, you would have to have your family burn it for you with your cremation, okay? In Iceland, when Egil died, there were very, very few trees around for firewood, so cremations almost never happened in Iceland. So when cremation is not possible, you have to be buried. Burial is the only option. You may want to take your valuables before you die and bury them yourself in a secret place somewhere. So the funeral rites in this case started before you are even dead, actually. Also, another law created by Odin that you see here. You could see that your ashes could also be taken out to sea, and if you were a great man, you should be buried in a mound, or a memorial stone would be erected near your gravesite. We find thousands of these memorial stones all over Scandinavia, and this was firstly done to show a mourning place, of course, for the dead, like a gravesite, but it could also be kind of a space where the spirit of the dead of a great man would live on, and then they could do things like worship or leave offerings there, his descendants or family members or whatever. It's not that it believed that the spirit of the dead would stay there in that mound or a monumental stone forever or anything like that. People could, of course, move on to the afterlife after they had been buried or funeral. It's just that these monuments of the dead may attract that spirit to visit that location for occasional periods of time, and even gods could be attracted to the statues of themselves or monuments. This is explained clearly in the ancient Roman tradition in Nature of the Gods by Cicero, and similar beliefs like this can be found from all over the world. Next source of a funeral or burial is also in Ynglinga Saga. The god Freyr, who in this source was a priest, a king living amongst humans in Sweden at the time. It's also estimated to be around the 1st century AD. Freyr got sick and he died, and this is when the cremation age ended, it says in that source, and people started to bury their dead more, like I just spoke about. Freyr was the one who sparked this age. He was buried in a great tomb and given offerings so that peace and prosperity continued. As Freyr, in life, he was the king who basically used his magic and his powers to bring a good harvest to the people of Svithjod, Sweden. So you can see in this text, the Swedes actually thought that Freyr was alive in his tomb, where he was buried for 3 years. And then they found out he was dead, and they basically discovered that, okay, he didn't need to be alive to give us a good harvest and peace and prosperity here. As long as his body would remain buried in Sweden, and we gave offerings to it, the good harvest and peace and prosperity would continue. Also, they did not want to cremate him because of the fear that his spirit, along with the peace and prosperity, would leave Sweden to other lands. So this goes back to what I spoke about. If they are buried, the belief is that some of their spirit stays, it remains in the area. If they were cremated, they can move on to faraway lands and afterlives a lot easier. Also, it seems like the cremated ones more often go to Valhalla. Not always, but at least in the sources that seems more common. And possibly the ones who get a burial mound, they might be more likely to go to Folk-vongr, actually. Those are just my thoughts, though I'll let you know you won't find any sources for that. Remember how Odin chooses half the warriors slain and goes to Valhalla, and the goddess Freya takes the other half of the fallen warriors to Folk-vongr. Freya very clearly represents the egg in the myths, and Freya's realm, Folk-vongr, could potentially be symbolic of the womb or just the female stomach. So you bury the greatest heroes, not just in a hole in the ground. You don't stick them in a hole in the ground like the peasants would be, because that's for regular people. No. In great men, their funerals, you build them a mound, a burial mound, simulating a pregnant woman's belly. Like, that's where they go. They're going back to they're going back to Freya, they're going back to Folk-vongr, and then when you open up the mound and dig into it many years later, as we know, this was done very, very often. It was a common practice. I've done videos on that. They dig into the burial mounds and retrieve the body of the dead. That is when the spirit of that dead person can leave out of the opening in the burial mound, just as the child leaves out the opening in the mom's puss. And then the spirit in that burial mound comes out at the same time and inhabits the body of that newborn child at the same time to be reincarnated. This is all just my theory, mind you, and I'll do a longer video on that, but we do have one source telling almost this exact same thing, and that's the tale of Ólafs, Geirstaða, which I'll speak about in a minute. But another one before we go on, in Sörla Þáttr, Freya is said to be responsible for raising the dead. And this also explains why Freyr was said to have sex with his own sister Freya, because Freyr represents the seed, and Freya represents the egg, and Folk-vongr represents the womb or the burial mound. And in this source, Freyr was a priestly man believed to be a god, and he was actually planted in the ground, simulating the having sex with Freya. Long story, see my video I did on Freyr. This practice was not just done for Freyr, though. He wasn't the only one buried in the burial mound. Like I said, this sparked off an age of much more burials happening in history. Many kings and chieftain and great men were now buried in a burial mound and given offerings to, actually, all the way up through the Viking Age until Christianity came in and made it illegal to bury people this way and to give them offerings after their death. According to Flateyjarbók and many other law codes from the time, these burial mounds were called blóthaugar, the sacrifice burial mounds, and they can be found all over Scandinavia, and that's where you have actually seen me doing some of my offerings when I'm back home in Norway. And this was done for a few purposes, but good health and good harvest were the main purposes. That's why they'd leave offerings out to these burial mounds. We might even say something about Hálfdanar the Black Saga. It explains here that harvests were actually better under the rule of Hálfdanar the Black than with previous kings. Just like Freyr, harvests were better under him too. And when Hálfdanar died, his body was divided into 4 pieces, and each piece was buried in a mound in a different district to ensure the continuation of the good harvest in each area. So I guess we consider that a funeral practice too, although I would not recommend doing that. So you don't have to be a god, basically, to get buried in a burial mound at your funeral. Any great man could be buried in a great mound in order to be given offerings to and kind of keep your spirit near the land to help out some of your descendants and your people or whatever. This is what the Alfablot and ancestral worship is all about, which I have done videos on. Women, too, could be buried in burial mounds. We're not leaving them out. But it's much more uncommon. We don't find it in the written sources, but we find it in the archaeological finds sometimes. The biggest one is the Oseberg ship, where 2 women basically got the most extravagant, biggest, richest burial at the time, and that's in Tønsberg, Norway. But yeah, burial mounds were mostly reserved for men. So now we spoke about cremation or burial mound or whatever. We spoke about the places where the funeral could happen. Let's speak about the position that they were buried in. So of course, from the archaeological finds, most of them were buried laying down. But some are laid out in the fetal position like this. Again, this is mocking the child's position in the womb. All over the world this is done among more primitive peoples, and that reflects a reincarnation belief that they bury him in the child's position to basically send it more quickly to inhabit the spirit of a child in the womb. But in this video I want to speak about seated burials specifically. There's a couple details of a funeral practice. One of them comes in Ólafs Geirstaða's tale. King Ólafs, basically before his death, instructs people to bury him a specific way. He instructs them to build a large burial mound, and this one, by the way, is in my hometown in Norway, right here. I went to visit this grave. And he instructs them to fence off the burial mound so that no cattle can come in. And some other practices too. After he is buried, he tells them to do, like, bring him a half øre of silver, which was just a little coin, and give him offerings, and that will help against any plague that comes into the village. So pretty normal alfablot described here, which I have done other videos on. But later on in the story, 200 years later, we find that Ólafs is there in the sitting position of a chair, and his spirit instructs someone in a dream to come into the burial mound where he is buried 200 years later, take his sword, cut off his head, put the skull in his lap, and eventually that leads to him being reincarnated as King Olav the Saint in that story. So exactly the theory that I spoke about is mentioned in this source. A similar account, just kind of a similar story, comes in Grettis Saga during his encounter with the Draugur, the zombie named Kar the Old. It also happens in Hervarar Saga, where Hervor goes to her father Angatyr's burial mound and goes in to obtain the sword Tyrfing. You saw this in the movie The Northman, where he went off to fight the Draugur in the burial mound and obtain the sword. So these heroes are all buried in a chair, sitting in a chair. But we have more possibilities of this in the archaeological finds. We find people like in sitting position. Of course, the chair would have decomposed over 1,000 years, so we don't know exactly how common that was. But yeah, if a hero was buried in this sitting position, it may be another sign that they were going straight to Folk-vongr. Like I mentioned a minute ago, Freya takes the ones buried in a mound, and he takes them to Folk-vongr. We don't know that, but I will say the only mention of Folk-vongr in the reliable Norse sources is mentioned when Freya takes half the men specifically and directs the sittings in the hall. So maybe those buried in a seated position were aimed at going to Folk-vongr. Again, a possible funeral ritual aimed at reincarnation, or to at least speed up the reincarnation process, and maybe even control it, like who it is, who you would be reincarnated as. So that's just one more theory on funeral practices and reincarnation, afterlife. Let's go on to some more things that we know for sure about funerals. One is in the Ynglinga Saga, and there it says that hell shoes are put on a man's feet to allow them to walk to Valhalla. We don't know what hell shoes are, but it would be some sort of special shoe that was probably put on them for their funeral. That might be worth looking into, actually, in the archaeology, but of course, shoes are not something that would be preserved well over 1,000 years buried, so we don't know. It's just an important point that some type of shoes referred to as hel shoes would be put on the body before the funeral. Another thing, singing and poems. These were definitely done for people at their funeral. For great heroes and kings, we actually have records of these poems, but possibly at everyone's funeral, some sort of poem or song was said. These are called Eyrbyggja, or funeral poems. We have a ton of skaldic poems, basically told at the deaths of a great king, documenting their accomplishments. There's tons more of the funeral poems, like really famous ones like Håkonarmál, Grímnismál, about the deeds of the great Harald Fairhair. There are tons of skaldic poems about a man's life that were told at his funeral that we can find. So yeah, it would be a great addition for us today to compose a little bit of poetry at the funeral of a loved one, documenting their deeds and accomplishments. What you might also want to do, wear white. So the Christian tradition that has stuck with us for a long time now, since its acceptance into Europe, you're supposed to bury the dead in black, and now even today everybody at the funeral and all the guests wear black. We do this today, even though we may not be Christian and may not believe in that, so black's just something respectful to wear to a funeral. But this has absolutely not been something practiced anywhere in the world before that. We have some cryptic evidence in the Norse written sources that people went to funerals in white, but even more in the archaeological evidence. What little clothes we have preserved over 1,000 years, a lot of it is white clothing. And especially from a lot of these folk tales documented from later on in time, the ghosts or the spirits were wearing some sort of white tunic or dress. So people were almost always buried with white, even going long after the Viking Age. And this is completely normal around the world. In the Hindu religion, which is the most closely related, still surviving religion to the Norse one, actually, the guests and dead still wear white at their funerals today. There are a few explanations for this, but my favorite comes from Sadhguru. So he says just like black absorbs the light and the white reflects the light, black is going to absorb all of the energy around and white is going to reflect all that energy around. So if there is mourning and if there is sadness or any negative energy around like that at a funeral, white would be better to wear as it reflects basically the energy rather than absorbing it. Especially for the dead more than anyone, it's important to dress them in white so that they have a smooth transition to the next life and they're not absorbing all the sadness and sorrow around like they would do if they are wearing black. Like I said, we have evidence of this being done all along the Indo-European area for a long time before, and I'd bet almost anything that Norse funerals were all white too. People wore that. Let's talk about other celebrations. Feasts. Many sources of funeral feasts. Of course, this happened. It's not like today, some shitty little reception where everyone is all moody and depressed and they're eating crappy snacks and bullshit little sandwiches, okay? No, I'm talking a proper funeral feast. A celebration of someone's life. Drinking, playing music, the mourning, yeah, of course there would be sadness, but also celebrating the life of the dead person. In Ynglinga Saga, King Aldis had a battle with the Finns, and he won against a chieftain called Frosti, and he killed him. King Aldis wanted to get married to Frosti's daughter. Her name was Skjalv. But Skjalv only agreed to do this if Aldis would hold a funeral feast for her deceased father. Aldis agreed to this, even though he was his enemy basically, and he held him a funeral feast. So funeral feasts seem to have been a required thing for, especially for men of a certain status. And the feast size probably varied among class and wealth of the deceased. So we have here Frosti's own daughter that wants a feast, and it was a hell of a party when the father died. Very different to our sad, depressing, mourning funeral picnics that we have today. In fact, it even appears as though the dead actually prefer to be sent off with a happy feast, really celebrating their life. In Helgakviða, Hundingsbana, the dead Helgi actually travels to his open burial mound where he lies with his wife Sigrun, who was still surviving, and she was in his burial mound mourning him. Here, Helgi is described as being bloody with ice-cold hands and frost in his hair, and he tells her, stop weeping, please, that weeping over my dead burial mound causes me pain. And it's also a similar thing in the Laxdæla saga, with a similar account of the dead being troubled and even in pain as they see their loved ones mourning them. So, very important not to dwell on the mourning for so long, because that will trouble the dead in their afterlife. You have to send them off with a grand feast and happiness, and that would bring the best results in the afterlife. Another source, Eyrbyggja saga, shows little glimpse into this. There was a sacred hall called Helgafell in Iceland where the dead were believed to reside. But one day a shepherd gets a glimpse into this hill, into the realm of the dead, and he sees a hell of a party. There are horns blowing, they're drinking, they're partying, all that stuff. He also notices that the spirits of the dead are in a hill or a mound. Same thing as all the other sources say, where the elves or ancestral spirits were said to live. This would be in a hill or mound. even if they weren't buried necessarily in a mound. In Landnámabók, it also supports this, saying that Thorolf's kinsmen believed that they would enter this holy hill after they died. So sending the dead away with a hell of a party definitely may have some effect on how they spend their time in the afterlife. If it's all mourning and sadness, the dead may go to a negative place temporarily, or at least have a negative time temporarily, until the mourning stops. I will say, though, it does seem like the feasts happened 7 days after the death, or 7 days after the funeral. We don't know, so the funeral feast may not be on the funeral itself. We find Old Norse, the Old Norse word sjöund, basically meaning the seventh night, and it's referred to in various law codes like these I'll put up here, and it's usually used for court cases or summons, like come here in 7 days, but it also speaks about funeral services and feasts, and that the next ruler, like the king's son, was not allowed to take over the father's throne until 7 days after the king had passed away. So it may be better to have a funeral feast 7 days after the funeral, but at least definitely have the funeral feast 7 days after the death. Maybe ideally schedule it so you can have it on the same day, depending on how quickly you can bury them after the funeral. And this is really what makes me the most sick about funerals today. Firstly, it's a bit too sad and depressing. You know, a funeral should be a celebration of life, not all mourning and crying, but, you know, that's not the worst. The worst part, take your time with it. The funeral and customs around burying a dead person should last many days for an honorable person. I have been to funerals where they are literally turning people out like a production line, like the damn church is scheduling a funeral every 30 minutes. So they say their crap and rush the mourning guests out before the next ones come in. It's disgusting. And on top of all that, how much are we paying these damn people? How much does a funeral cost these days? 10 grand, 20 grand, whatever. It's an absolute disgrace and an attack on our spirituality. And I can't believe we have allowed that to happen to our sacred funeral rites and to our loved ones that are coming to this point. Yeah, enough of my rants. Next source. The one and only detailed account of a funeral we have, the full Viking funeral, and that is told in Ibn Fadlan's account. Now, this was a Muslim traveler documenting the Rus Vikings, and he was visiting the east of Europe. It's not going to be super accurate, maybe, because the Rus Vikings definitely would have had different customs than their, distant relatives in Scandinavia, but they had only been living there for a couple generations at the time, and this is basically the only source documenting a full Norse, apparently Norse funeral. So we're going to have to use it, and it is going to be close enough, at least. So here it goes. I'm just listing off some of these funeral practices here and giving a quick explanation. So a chieftain died. He was put temporarily in a grave, which was covered for 10 days until they had sewn new clothes for him. So this could potentially be just because the funeral wasn't ready and they needed to bury him in a certain way. And that's why they buried him, so his spirit would remain until the funeral, until rest of the preparations were ready, and maybe even they sewed him a white outfit if they didn't have one. Next, one of his slave women volunteered to join him in the afterlife. Okay, that one is pretty clear, at least from the source. It seems as both an expected thing by the people, but also a voluntary act by the slave to sacrifice herself to be with her master in the afterlife. I'm not going to get into whether that was it true or not, but yeah, at least from this source, we can assume that is true. So the slave girl was guarded closely. She was given intoxicating drinks, and she sang and danced happily, it says here. Then they pulled the chieftain's longship ashore. That would have been in a river or lake somewhere. They pulled it onto a platform of wood. So here, this is going to be a ship cremation. It could be for a couple reasons, and they kept the ship on the river or lake temporarily so that it would keep the chieftain here and not let him cross the river into the realm of the dead in the afterlife. They made a bed for the dead chieftain on the ship, and then an old woman, referred to as the Angel of Death, put cushions on the bed. The significance of her putting the cushions on, I don't know, but she is the one who would be leading the rest of the funeral. They dug up the chieftain and gave him new clothes that they had sewn, probably the white tunic, like I said, and maybe also those hail shoes, as I spoke about earlier. Then they gave him gifts. They gave him his weapons, intoxicating drinks, fruits, and a string. Some people translate this as a stringed instrument. I've seen other translations as a drum. So pretty simple, you know, it may be an instrument and some other things that the king or chieftain would want to take to the afterlife with him. And there is a more spiritual nature to some of these items, but I won't go into that in this video. Then they put him on his ship with all of his belongings, and then they had 2 horses run themselves sweaty. And they cut the horses into pieces, and they threw the meat into the ship. Okay, so he wanted his horses taken with him to the afterlife too, and they basically ran the horses until they were in a sweat, which ties into this frenzied state that they wanted them to die in. I'll speak about that in just a second. Then they sacrificed a hen and a cock too. And then the slave girl went from one tent to the other and had sex with all the men around there. And every man told her, okay, tell your master that I'm only doing this because of my love to him. Sounds kind of gay, but all jokes aside, though, this was for a very specific reason that ties into the same frenzied state that I'll talk about in just a second. And this was all morning they did these rituals. Then the afternoon comes. They moved the slave girl to something that looked like a door frame, where she would lift it on the palms of the men 3 times over the door frame. And every time the girl told of what she saw. The first time she saw her dead father and mother. The second time she saw all of her dead relatives, and the third time she saw her master in the afterworld. There it was green and beautiful, and together with him he saw men and young boys in the afterlife, and she saw that her master beckoned for her. This also happened in a source called Þáttr. I just did a video on that a week back. Basically, raising yourself over a door frame was a way to get a glimpse into the realm of the dead. Then a thrall girl was taken away to the ship, but not in the tent where the chieftain laid. They removed her bracelets, and her bracelets were given to the old woman, and they removed the slave girl's finger rings and gave them to the old woman's daughters, who had guarded her the whole day. See my video I did on arm rings and how these could possibly symbolize the life cycle of a person, and now it was time to give those up to someone else. More intoxicating drinks were given to her, all the while she was singing happily. And then 6 men entered into the tent to have sex with the slave girl. She was about to have a train run on her. And they beat their shields so that her screams could not be heard. I do not support or condone any of this at all, just saying. This was done in that source, and there was a specific reason for it. Then they put her onto her master's bed. Then 2 men grabbed her hands and wrists, and the angel of death put a rope around her neck, while 2 men pulled the rope. Then the old woman stabbed the girl between her ribs with the knife, and then relatives of the dead chieftain arrived with a burning torch, and it was them who finally set the ship aflame. And then it reads, the fire facilitates the voyage to the realm of the dead, But unfortunately, the account does not tell which realm of the dead the deceased was supposed to go to. Afterwards, a round burial was built over the ashes of the ship and all of the possessions and king and slave girl, and they erected a mound over it, and they erected a staff made of birch wood where they carved the name of the dead chieftain. So that last part is basically identical to the laws that Odin established about funerals and monuments, basically raising a mound and setting up a monument there. So everything seems pretty clear about that funeral, except for, the hitting the gangbang on a slave girl. So this was done for the same reason that the horses were ran to a sweat. Those things were done for the same reason that the slave girl was given intoxicating drinks and singing and dancing wild. It's the same reason that warriors who died in battle were said to go to Valhalla. When you die in this frenzied, ecstatic state, it makes death and the transition to the afterlife easier. Makes it smoother, and maybe even the journey to Valhalla is possible when you die in this state. When you get to these states of frenzy, whether it be in a state of rage that a man might feel in battle, or a horse might feel if he ran himself to a frenzy, or a lady who danced and sexed her way to this frenzied state. It's the same frenzy, just different ways to get there. And it's actually what Odin's name means and what he largely represents in the myths. This ecstatic state that humans and even animals can get to during ritual or death. There is some more evidence of this frenzied or erotic energy was also connected with death deities. Death is sometimes portrayed erotically. It could be described as an erotic embrace between the dead man and a lady who represents the afterlife. Often this was Hel. In the 9th century poem Ynglinga, the kings are said in several stanzas to be in Hel's embrace, but it could also be the goddess Ran who received those who died at sea. And Ran's 9 daughters were also depicted as erotic partners of the dead, and many skaldic poems praise the brave sea warriors who fought against the natural forces of the sea, but finally has to give up, and then he enters Ran's bed in some sources, and then is embraced by her 9 daughters. Even more commonly, the Valkyries, who were connected with death, also have a constant erotic love theme with the hero of the tale. Exactly what all this means and the journey that we go on after we die, we don't know, but I guess maybe we could say, and most of us probably agree, if you are going to die and you have a choice about how, best to do it while it's having either sex or fighting. That sounds like a pretty good idea. Or if you're a horse, you may want to die in your running state. Whatever. We all get to this frenzied state in different ways. Whatever floats your boat. If you died in your bed or something, it might be a good idea for your funeral customs to have something else to accompany you in this frenzied state to transfer some of that frenzy, some of that life force to help you on your journey to the realm of the dead. Human sacrifices are not allowed in this day and age, even if they are willing, but maybe an animal sacrifice, like a horse getting to this frenzied state, may be a possible way for us to do that today. How common was this funeral? Don't know. This was done by the Rus Vikings again in the Eastern Europe. They were Swedes basically, but they had been living there for a couple generations. It may have not been done like this back home in Scandinavia. I'm just speaking about it to give some options as to some of the things that may have been done in Scandinavia and why, but every funeral would have been done slightly differently, and of course chieftains would have had a more extravagant funeral like this as opposed to a peasant. So while I touched on the subject of Jan and sea, let's talk about sea deaths and drowning, because they obviously don't get a funeral, right? Not with their body disposed of, at least. They are sinking to the bottom of the ocean. So in sea deaths, Jan, the goddess, the wife of Ægir, receives all of those who died at sea. In multiple sources it says this, and it's described that she catches the drowned in her net at sea. It's probably a pretty comfortable place because you get an erotic embrace by her and her 9 daughters. Now her 9 daughters are symbolic of waves, and that's actually what their names mean, different types of waves. But I would absolutely say that these were believed to be very real female spiritual beings. This explains why the Vikings were some of the most brave sea explorers the world has ever seen. You know, being out at sea is scary. It's really terrifying, even today. Now imagine you were 1,000 years ago and you were in a rowboat and you had no idea where you were going, and you were probably going to suffocate a miserable death if things didn't go your way. Not many men in their right mind would sign up to do that. But if you died at sea, and then you had 9 goddesses erotically welcoming you, okay, that doesn't sound so bad. So yeah, let's row this shit out and try and discover some new lands then. But even more info about a funeral here, specifically about men who had died at sea, comes in the Eyrbyggja Saga. It describes Þórild and his men being killed at sea. A funeral feast was held for them, and during the funeral feast, the men's spirits entered the hall dripping wet, and they were welcomed because of the belief that attending one's own funeral after drowning was a sign that one was well received by the goddess Ram. So even if someone dies at sea, or somehow, some way, if their body is lost and can't be found to bury it or give it a proper funeral, it's still appropriate in Norse tradition to hold a funeral for them. Oh, let's talk about ship burials, or ship cremations, because we have written sources of these and even more archaeological evidence. It was done for the same purpose. When you're buried or cremated with these things, those things accompany you to the afterlife. Pretty simple. That you need this. You take this ship. You get buried with the ship in order to get sent across a body of water in the afterlife. In the Norse beliefs, that is the river Gjöll, the river you have to cross to get to Hel. In the Greek myths, it's the river Styx. In the Hindu, it's the river Vaitanari, and much more different rivers around the world. So if you are a chieftain who was wealthy enough to get buried with a ship, you could basically sail that over the river, while all the other peasants have to wait in line and cross a long bridge, the Jallabru. Horses, same thing. People were buried with horses so that you can actually ride it through Hel, and all the other peasants have to walk, pretty much. That's why there were 2 horses in the chieftain's funeral, so his slave girl could also ride the horse. And ideally, you could bring 2 horses with you and a ship for your funeral. So you sail over the river Gjöll, and when you land in Hel, you get on your horses and you ride them through Hel. So why would we all want to do this so quickly? Well, it all comes back to reincarnation, guys. The faster you get through the realm of the dead, the faster you can be reborn. So if you can afford it, it is a great idea to be buried or cremated with a ship and a horse. But of course, this is not necessary. It was just for, you can't bury a ship and a horse with every person who dies, so only the chieftains or royalty would be able to afford this. Let's talk about Jallabru, because I think this is going to give us another funeral ritual. The bridge to Hel over the river Gjöll. So you know Heimdall's horn, Jallar horn. Basically that is the horn that is blown and it's heard in all 9 worlds. So Jallar basically means loud sounding or trembling, like trembling horn or trembling bridge. There's plenty of evidence that horns were used by real humans in ritual, and probably also in funerals too. So the bridge, Jallabru, the bridge to Hel, is guarded by the giantess Murguðr, who also asks the dead to state their business when they cross the bridge, so they can pass. So in theory, by blowing a horn, you can make this trip across the bridge unnoticed by the guardian giantess, okay? The bridge is loud anyway, and the river is actually called Jöl. This means noisy. So when you blow the horn, whether it be made from a cattle horn or a ram's horn or a bronze lure, the resonance, the trembling of that, the vibration, okay? That is exactly the sound that is needed to maybe make that trip across Jöllabru, the trembling bridge, a little bit easier. There are three purposes for this. First, it helps with this blowing horn, or that frequency, that resonance from instruments. It could help with shamanic type rituals where people send their spirit into the realm of the dead, just like Hermodr did in the Norse myths while he was alive and traveling to Hel to bring back Balder and Nanna. And then we also have shamanic rituals all around the world that use things like horns and drums, basically a shaman sending their spirits into the realm of the dead. Second purpose, the horn can help bring back dead spirits over the bridge. This can be done to humans who have died and they're now in Hel, and maybe their spirit comes back to our living realm. Maybe they just come to say hi or watch over their family, or maybe they awaken to take whatever offering might be left at their burial mounds, or sometimes even haunt people, as we have many sources for all that. So blowing the horn may also help those spirits cross that bridge into our realm temporarily. And finally, the blowing horn might be used for funerals. Maybe the first trip of the dead into the underworld, just to make that trip across the bridge a little easier and quicker. Like shake up the bridge with the vibration of the horn, and also create that sound that your spirit goes in the opposite direction of, just so it can find their way, right? So like go away from the blowing horn. And this is the number one problem that people will face in their journey to the realm of the dead, and primitive beliefs all around the world. It's not that the realm of the dead is a bad or unpleasant place, it's just that you are not all there once you're there, and you can be lost wandering for a very long time. Horns can help, but there are many other things that can do this, that can help you find your way. But I wanted to mention the horns because I think that's one of the most common ones used in Norse tradition at the funerals, even though we don't have any clear sources telling us that. The evidence from pagan times, it's all there. And also horns, fun fact, were made illegal when Christianity came into Scandinavia, as were drums. They were all made illegal, basically, showing that this was maybe something too pagan for the Christians to be doing after the Viking Age. So the horn can help shake up this border between our world and the next, and that's why I do it in all of my blots and even my meditation, and I would also do it at funerals too. We might also speak about Hel's Gate, or Helgrind, as it's called in Old Norse. In Hervarar saga, when Hervor goes to her father's burial mound and digs into it to obtain the sword Tyrfing, the dead Angatyr buried in the mound wakes up and speaks, and he refers to the entrance of his grave as Hel's Gate, suggesting that there is no distinction between the realm of the dead, the gate there, and the physical place where the dead is laid to rest. So that could be just creative poetry, I don't know, referring to the entrance of the tomb as Hel's Gate. I don't know, but maybe it's that is part of the funeral too, that there was some sort of funeral ritual, possibly carrying the dead in their coffin or whatever to this gate of the burial mound, and then through it was in fact a tomb, or the mound burial, just like Odin's eight-legged horse Sleipnir carries people into the realm of the dead, and 4 pallbearers, if you're carrying the coffin, and 4 guys, that also has 8 legs carrying the person to the realm of the dead. And I think in either the Hindu or the Siberian beliefs, there is also an 8-legged horse that is basically responsible for transporting the dead to the underworld. Almost done. Finally, let's get on to the mythological sources. So these are the myths about the gods, and they were not real events, they're not historical events that happened. But some very good info is included in here that we can learn about funerals. First comes in the Prose Edda, it tells about a funeral involving the rite of cutting fingernails. The reason for this is that the nails from the dead are used for the construction of the ship Naglfar, the ship that was used to transport the army of Jotnar at Ragnarök. So that's how they build the ship, so that's why people cut the nails of the dead to minimize the building materials for this ship that brings about Ragnarök. I don't even want to get into what Naglfar is, because we have to speak about what Ragnarök is, and that will take an hour. And then we have to speak about the traditional magical uses of nails, which will take another hour. Just cut your fingernails at your funerals, okay? Fingernails and your toenails. This was done all over the world for various different purposes. Just do it. Another one comes in Grímnismál, the source there. It describes how Valhalla's roof is made out of spears and shields, okay? This is also similar to the burial mound of Geirröð, described in Þáttr Bjarmangs. We're not sure if we have any archaeological finds of, shields and spears on the ceiling of a burial mound, but the Geirstaða burial mound specifically had a bunch, I think like 24 ceremonial shields found in it, so they were on the floor, but of course they could have been on the ceiling of the burial mound at one point, and they were painted in all yellow and black. So if you want to go to Valhalla, maybe a burial mound, but you construct the ceiling with shields and spears. That might be a good idea at your funeral if you do that. Another source, Sigurdakviða. The Valkyrie Brynhildr instructs a number of slaves to be sacrificed for the funeral of her hero Sigurd, and how their bodies were supposed to be arranged on the funeral pyre, as in the following stanza. So this guy actually had a total of 13 slaves to accompany him to the afterlife. That's not legal today, so we can't do that, but that's just a interesting source. Another one is Beowulf, actually. A great one, who they were also pagan at the time and following the same religion that they would have been doing it in Scandinavia, but it's an Old English source. There's a few funerals in Beowulf. One of the funerals is for the chieftain Skill, who died, and he had the traditional Viking funeral where they put you on a ship with treasure and they light it on fire and send it out to sea. Not much more detail is given there, but it does say that 12 battle-brave men rode around the mound, similar to other rituals circling counterclockwise that we find all over Scandinavian tradition, so it might be a nice idea to walk or ride circles around the burial place in a Norse funeral. Another funeral in Beowulf that goes into a little detail is Beowulf's own funeral. Not much is given, except that Beowulf, before he dies, tells his man Wiglaf to put him on the funeral pyre and then constructs a mound over him as a monument to him. And that should be on top of a cliff overlooking the sea. Not sure the exact reason for that, but both of the funerals here show that a mound was constructed, and it wasn't actually the location of the men's cremation. So it's also cool, even if the person that is dead got cremated, it's cool to build a burial mound for them as a memorial and a place where their spirit can visit. The mound or the stone does not necessarily have to be the actual burial place. Finally, last one, and then the video's over. Baldr's funeral. Same thing. This one is given in pretty good detail after the death of Baldr, and I'm going to list some of the rites here that are described and give a little explanation. After Baldr's death, he was carried to his ship Ringhorni, the greatest of all ships. Odin, while he was put on there, whispered something into Baldr's ear, but we don't know what that was. It was said to be one of the great mysteries of the universe, as told in Vafthrudnismal, so maybe it was a custom for people to just whisper something special in the ear of someone at their funeral. Odin also placed the arm ring, Draupnir, the soul ring, on the funeral pyre. See my video about that and how arm rings were very likely, they symbolize some sort of life cycle and soul. So this is yet another ritual that may have been done to speed up the reincarnation, burning or burying someone with an arm ring at their funeral. Baldur's wife, Nanna, threw herself on the funeral pyre to be reunited with her husband in death. I don't recommend that today, but pretty clear from many other times in history a woman would kill herself in order to be with her husband in death. Romeo and Juliet, many Norse sagas about this. This happened all over. Then Baldur's horse was also put onto the funeral pyre. Okay, I already explained why they did that in the previous sources. Also, Thor kicked the small dwarf that was named Litir on the funeral pyre to burn with Baldur and Nanna. Dwarves usually symbolize some sort of energy or spiritual being that are responsible for giving each human their traits that they will be born with. Some have connected the dwarves with DNA, for example, or whatever our ancestors' perception of DNA would have been at the time, or something similar. The dwarf Litir, we can't say for sure exactly what he represents, but his name basically means color, hue, or appearance. So there may have been some funeral ritual that was aimed at influencing the color or appearance of a person that they might take in their next life. But dwarves are a long story for another day. And then finally, nobody was strong enough to push Baldur's ship out to sea. Even Thor was not strong enough, so the gods had to call the giantess Hyrökin, and she came riding on a wolf, and she pushed Baldur out to sea so hard that fire flashed and all the earth shook. I have no idea what the giantess Hyrökin could represent, but her name means fire withered or something like fire curl or fire wrinkle, something like that. She also bears some resemblance to other witches or giantesses riding on wolves, and wolves often symbolizing death. We also have a rune stone that we think depicts Hyrökin here, so possible that this was maybe a part of the funeral too, like a mock enactment of this myth, like the Angel of Death, for example, in Ibn Fadlan's account maybe come out and pushes the ship out to sea to conclude the funeral. So there's a lot about Baldur's funeral we can't be sure about, and a lot of it is symbolic, related to the events of Ragnarök and the seasons changing. I've done videos on that. But what we can say for certain is that the rituals surrounding Baldur's funeral were all centered around reincarnation. This was the main purpose that all of this was done, and like more things actually were done after this event in the myth, like Hermod's ride to hell. All of this was done with aims at bringing Baldur back to life, so we can assume, since many of these funeral rituals we know of from this source, humans did too, which maybe also influenced bringing their loved ones back to life, reincarnated as soon as possible, just like the gods wanted Baldur to be reincarnated as soon as possible. So take from that what you will. And that's it, guys. That's all the info I could find about funerals and anything related to it in the Norse sources. But there is lots more to talk about. Like I mentioned earlier, the archaeological finds and other funeral rituals from different cultures in the world can really give us some answers when we compare it to the Norse. So I will do more videos on that. This video just goes over some of the rituals. We don't have enough information to reconstruct a funeral the way that it was historically done, and the truth is that there is no way to know. And there is no one way at all either. Depending on the situation, funerals could be very different in certain places for certain people in the Viking world. The goal of this video is just to explain that a few things were done and why they were done, because as always, nothing in the old religions of the world were done at random. Everything was done for a purpose, and it's up to you guys to determine what things you want to take out of this and what has meaning for you and what you would like to practice in a historical funeral, depending on the purpose and desired goal and what makes the most sense to you. So hope that helps. That was a long video. That's all for today. Vi ses nästa gång.